Good afternoon, 141ers. Today we're going to talk about elasticity of demand, but before that we're going to talk about percentages for just a brief moment. So elasticity of demand is all we're going to cover. We'll have some discussion this afternoon, and then we'll move on to other elasticities, and we'll go further in calculating elasticities as well. So elasticity is a concept in economics that sometimes students have a hard time with because of the quantitative nature of it. But it doesn't have to be as complex as it seems if you just think about how we view percentages and change in other contexts. So one of the worst shows, in my opinion, on TV of the last 15 years was a show called The Biggest Loser. And if you're unfamiliar with the show, what they would do is they would bring, I don't remember, 32 or 40 or 20 or some amount of people that were very, very overweight, and they would have a competition to see who could lose the most weight. And the way that they evened the playing field was you would win by who lost the biggest percentage of their weight. So the first winner of the show, I knew he was going to win because I actually watched it, I hate to admit it, had been a Division I wrestler at the University of Iowa. I thought, if anybody knows how to lose weight, and if anybody can withstand the torture that they went through to try to do it, the exercising for hours and hours a day, it was incredibly unhealthy, it's a Division I wrestler. So this gentleman started at 400 pounds. And as he lost weight, they always calculated his percentage of weight loss based on his original weight of 400 pounds. So 10% of 400 is 40, and 20% is 80 pounds, and 40% is 160 pounds. And he actually ended up losing just over 51 or over 50% of his body weight. It was in the low 50s somewhere. 50% is 200 pounds. The show, after it had been on for several years, then would go back and revisit the winners and find out how much of the weight they had gained back, which is always what happened. And when they went back and discussed how much weight they had gained back, they didn't discuss percentages. They discussed the absolute amount that they gained back. Because now saying that the contestant had gained 50% of his weight back would not be accurate, because 50% of 200 is 100 pounds. So when we think about percentages, we always think about the original, except in retail. In retail, we have this idea of markup and margin. Markup and margin are really the same thing. They're just looking at, are we talking about the cost or the amount that the margin between cost and the actual price. So I'll give you an example of that. Let's say that a new car dealer marks up their vehicles 20%. So a $30,000 vehicle to them, their cost, times 20% would give us $6,000. So their markup would be $6,000. And to find the price, we would take 30,000 times 120%, which is the same as 1.2, and we get $36,000. That would represent a markup of 20%. The margin, however, is not 20%. The margin in this case would be 6,000 divided by 36,000. 6 divided by 36 is 1/6, which is equal to 0.166 repeating, which is equal to 16.6 7%. My margin is 16.7%, whereas my markup is 20%. If we did this activity again, and we discussed a markup of 10% and figured out what the margin is, and let's make this as easy as possible. Let's say that our cost is $10,000. Our markup of 10% is $1,000, which means that our price is $11,000, and our margin is 1 over 11,000, which is 9.09%, I believe, but I'll get big pink out just to make sure. 1 divided by 11. Yep, my margin is roughly 9.1%. What's happening is when we have a margin of 20%, or a markup of 20%, our margin was 16.67. When our markup is only 10%, the difference between markup and margin is getting closer and closer. If we made it 5%, it would be even half that. If we go the other way and say that our markup is 100%, which is not uncommon in retail settings, if our cost is $100, our markup is also $100, which means that the price that we're going to ask is $200, and our margin is 100 over 200, which I know for sure is 50%. So as markup gets bigger, the difference between margin and markup diverge. The reason why I bring this up is because elasticity answers this question. If we're talking about margin or markup, we know which direction we're going. When we are talking about someone whose weight is fluctuating, we know what direction they're going. Elasticity isn't the same way. Elasticity is over a range or at a point, in which case we have to come up with a solution to solve this problem. So let's say, let's go back to our biggest loser example. I have a good friend from when I lived in South Dakota. He's a pretty big guy, and I would say that his weight fluctuated between 200 and 240 pounds. He's pretty athletic. He was usually active, but I've never known someone who ate as many peanut butter sandwiches as my friend Tom. And so his weight really fluctuated. At any given time, he'd be between this range, and it was like at 240, he'd say, oh, I got to do something about this, and he'd lose some weight, and he'd be down to 200, just yo-yo back and forth. So the question is, what does this 40 pounds represent? Does it represent 1/5 or 20%? Or does it represent 1/6 or 16.7%? So the question that we would be answering is, what percent does Tom's weight fluctuate? Well, saying 20% might be overstating it, because 40 pounds to 240 is only 16.7%. So what we could do is we could average these two. That would be okay. Or we could say the difference compared to the average of the whole. So we would say that Tom's weight fluctuates 40 over 220, which would be, I think, 18.18%. I'll check just to make sure. 4 divided by 22. Yep. 18.18. This is the general way that we're going to evaluate something called arc elasticity, and how we're going to make an approximation that doesn't err one way or the other. We'll talk about that error and when it becomes an issue. In this case, it wouldn't be a big deal. Over a bigger range, it could. Okay, enough math for now. Let's talk about elasticity of demand. So it is normally denoted elasticity with a small d. We will go on and talk about elasticity of supply, income elasticity, and cross-price elasticity in the same way on Wednesday. But if we get elasticity of demand, the other elasticities will follow. It'll be pretty easy. So elasticity of demand in its most general format is answering the question, how strong is the law of demand in a given marketplace? Or it would be answering the question, what's the difference between a market that has a demand curve like this and a market that has a demand curve like this? This market is not responsive to a change in price. These are called inverse demand curves, and it could make it a little bit misleading because we see big changes here. But remember that the quantity demanded is dependent on the price, not the other way around. And if the range of quantities is really pretty narrow, no matter what the price is, there's not a lot of responsiveness. Whereas this market, over a small range in prices, the quantity 1 and quantity 2, that's a big difference. If we look at that same price change over here, this is a tiny, tiny change in quantity, Q1 and Q2. This we would refer to in general as elastic. This we would refer to in general as inelastic. If something is elastic, it's responsive to price changes. You wear elastic clothing when you exercise because you're moving and it needs to change. It's responsive. When you wear clothing that's not elastic, it's inelastic, it might be uncomfortable. That's why when you come back from a formal gathering, you oftentimes, the first thing you do is change your clothing because it's inelastic. It doesn't change. It's how quantity responds to changes in price. There are a few things that determine how elastic or inelastic a good is. This is another area where elasticity is a little bit funny. Over the range of the demand curve, there's an inelastic portion and an elastic portion for every good. But in general, we can talk about goods being more or less elastic than others. And that's what we're doing right now. We'll save the sophistications or the subtleties. I don't think sophistications are a word. We'll save the subtleties for later this week. So things that are inelastic are things that, excuse me, they have few substitutes. Oftentimes they have low prices as well. Things that are elastic are just the opposite. They have many substitutes. And they might be more expensive. Substitution can really drive home what makes something elastic or inelastic. So my twin sister was diagnosed with juvenile diabetes, I believe that's type 1 diabetes, when we were 7 years old. So that means your pancreas doesn't work at all. You got to give yourself shots to regulate the amount of glucose in your body. Okay? So she is insulin dependent, and her responsiveness to changes in the price of insulin is very minimal. She has plenty of money. So if the price of insulin doubled, her responsiveness to that change in price would be very limited. There is very few substitutes for insulin for someone who is insulin dependent. Now, folks in the past have argued with me and they'd said, hey, not only is demand for insulin inelastic, it's perfectly inelastic. People aren't responsive to changes in price at all. Well, that's not exactly true. It kind of goes beyond economics. If the price of insulin were so high that you couldn't afford it, maybe you'd steal it, maybe you'd do other things to acquire it. That's not what we're talking about. We're asking, does the law of demand still hold? If the price went down, would people buy more? And if the price went up, would they buy less? Because it doesn't feel like something, if the price went down, that you'd say, oh, let's celebrate with more insulin. Or if the price went up, we'd say, oh, I'm not going to take shots today. I'll get sick and die a slow and terrible death of diabetes. It's not exactly that way. Let's think about a range of realistic prices. And we'll just say that the price of insulin doubles. This is something that is a contemporary topic. I've seen my sister sneak away. She's like a diabetes ninja. I mentioned she's my twin, so we spent a lot of time together. I can't remember ever seeing her take a shot. Like, I have to really, really think about seeing her do it. She's just really subtle and quick about, she'd get it out and give herself a shot and no one would even know it. And when you'd see her maybe fumbling under the table, not even fumbling, just put both of her hands underneath the table at a restaurant, that might be because we ordered dessert and she knows that that dessert has lots of sugar in it and she needs to top herself off. So she uses a little extra insulin. Do you think she'd be eating volcano cake if the price of insulin doubled or tripled or quadrupled? Well, at that point, she might not, which actually means that the quantity that she demands would go down because she wouldn't eat as much sugar. She would use substitutes to regulate the glucose in her blood. Now, can she do that completely? Absolutely not. But there is still some capacity for a change in the quantity demanded by the consumer. If it was really, really inexpensive, she might buy extra, maybe to leave at her friend's house in case she forgets it or something like that, or not drain every last bit out of each vial, something like that. Okay. Goods that are elastic have many substitutes. Things like Coke and Pepsi, they're really darn elastic. Things like your grain and your neighbor's grain, pretty good substitutes for each other. So they're very, very price sensitive. All right, so it's really about substitutes. It could be about prices as well. This is not the primary driver of elasticity, but if you think about things like table salt is typically an example of something that's inelastic. It's less than $1 for this giant container that has 1,000 servings in it. If the price doubled, probably wouldn't change how much table salt you buy. Okay, this is a good start on elasticity. Please make sure you watch this prior to class today. I'll send it out with an announcement. We'll see you this afternoon.